Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Ceres podcast. I'm Stelios, today's host and the founder and director of Ceres. Today I'm joined by John Webber, a true authority in the world of business rates, with over 35 years of experience. Me and John connected just before the election, and at the time we were hoping that with a strong majority it would push through essential reforms on business rates. Unfortunately, those changes didn't happen, as we know from yesterday's budget. But we're deep diving today into why the issue of business rates still remains so pressing and complex. John leads a powerhouse team of over 135 professionals at Colliers, where he's been instrumental in building one of the UK's top rating advisory services since 2005. He's frequently sought by the national media for his insights and works closely with MPs, ministers and civil servants to advocate for fairer business rates. Beyond that, he's an expert advisor to the National Trainers Federation and the Charity Retail Group, and he serves on the RICS Rating and Local Taxation Group. With roots in the Valuation Office Agency and extensive private sector experience, John is as knowledgeable as they come. Today's episode is sponsored by Ceres Deep Fryer Cleaner. Regular fryer boil-outs can transform your fryers, give you better oil life, reduce gas consumption, superior fried food, faster fryer recovery. It's not only about clean fryers, it's about safeguarding your frying equipment. A boil-out routine means that you're regularly inspecting for issues, ensuring your fryers or your pan's integrity, and it's also keeping that oil fresh. Think about it, your frying range is the heart of your operation, and daily use without a thorough clean can cost you plenty. Cleaner fryers means crispier, tastier food, reduced carbon build-up, lower running costs. Our customers have seen the benefits of extended oil life for their happier customers. Don't wait, start saving and growing your business with a consistent boil-out routine. Get your Ceres Deep Fryer Cleaner today at www.ceres.shop. With hundreds of dispatched orders daily, plus free delivery across mainland UK, we're also pleased to serve Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland and British Isles, and a few European countries. And just a reminder for our listeners, we have some exciting offers that are coming up that you won't want to miss, and also some great competitions. So get on our mailing list. The episode link will be in the show notes. We also keep competitions off social media because we really can't be bothered with getting scammed, and I don't think you guys want to get scammed either. So you could be our next big winner, and if you're not, well, if you bought something, you got a great deal too. Don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're having a little push on Twitter at the minute, or shall I say X. And if you want to dig deeper into today's topics, you can join us on Ceres Podcast Discussion Group via the link again in the episode show notes. Now, I hope you enjoy this episode with John from Colliers. I know I did. I learned a lot. And let us know what you think. John, thanks for joining me today, mate.
Yeah, good morning.
How you doing?
Yeah, pretty good, thank you. Pretty good. Just getting over the budget. So, you're trying to digest it all. So, it always looks slightly different the day after, I think.
It does, doesn't it? I've learnt that over the years.
Yeah, I think you react pretty quickly and people want to know and clients want to know what it means for them. And I think sometimes you almost need to sleep on it. And I think you can see things from a slightly different perspective. So I always think, that's why I think it takes a day or two to digest.
Absolutely. Look, there's no doubt that we're going into. We spoke about this before the election anyway. But there's no doubt that every budget's difficult. No one's ever sort of laughing at a budget, really, are they? And it's always the winners and losers. I'm always trying to see who's winning in this budget and who's losing in this budget. And this budget very much looks like it's business that is losing. That's the way I see it. NHS is probably winning, but yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? They made so many promises, and yeah, I'm not sure they really. I guess they would say they stuck to them, but whether they did or not is a different story.
Yeah, I mean, I think from business perspective, I don't think there was much in the way of good news yesterday, and I don't think people were expecting good news. And
No.
clearly, I think over the years, I think what I've always found when speaking to businesses of all sizes, small and large, is that people don't mind paying their fair share. I think people understand that in this country, people pay. We have to pay for public services. We have to pay to live in a country that we live in, which is a great country, and you understand there's a cost that goes with that. But I think that there's a frustration sometimes that politicians don't understand that actually making changes, certainly in a tax environment, can have a pretty direct effect on jobs and how businesses grow. And I think I think the concern about yesterday's budget was. And I think if you look at the concern really is if you look at the OBR, report and you look at the stats in there in terms of what business rates is going to take, if you look at the figure for last year, it was about 29 billion or thereabouts. But if you look at the figure that they're projecting by the year 29, you're up to nearly 40 billion pounds. So all of the narrative around the Labour Party and the Labour government looking at changing and helping business and understanding that business rates is not is a pretty hated tax, that they were going to do something about it. If you look at the OBR projections, what they are about to do is actually increase it by a third over the next 5 years. I'm not sure how that's going to help anybody. It certainly isn't going to help the high street. And I think that was the concern yesterday coming out, is that all of the noise that they've made and all of the hope and expectation that people had that they might finally start to address the business rates issue. And the biggest business rates issue all along is what I've always said is the quantum. It's not, there's lots of other things that are wrong with it. Don't get me wrong about the reliefs and the appeal process and all of those things. But the biggest issue people have is the quantum. And if the quantum is going to grow by a third in the next 5 years, I'm not sure that's going to solve any problems anyway.
No, it doesn't sound like it. It sounds like more of the same. And if you think, we spoke to each other before the election, about 2 weeks before, I think, and you were really hopeful. You sort of said, you sort of mentioned at the time, I hope whoever gets in next gets a big majority so they can actually fix the rates issue. They can actually get stuck in and deal with the big issues rather than, fight in Parliament over little things. And they've got the big majority they need, and yet they've not done it.
Yeah, and I think I think you're right. I think when we spoke, you could see that the Labour Party were going to be in power, and you could see that they were going to have a decent majority. I don't think we expected it to be as big as it was, and I think because of that, I think maybe naively I thought that now was the opportunity, given the narrative about they were going to grasp the nettle, they were going to deal with the business rates issue, they were going to overhaul it, they were going to abolish it, they were going to do all of these things that were going to be quite radical to actually once and for all address the issue that is business rates. And with a big majority, you were still hopeful that could happen. But I think what happens maybe in the, and I've spoken to, and I won't say who, but I've spoken to some senior civil servants over the last few weeks. And the kind of story that they're telling me is the fact that politicians are politicians, whichever party they are. And once they get into power, and once they actually have the weight of the civil service, which effectively controls the machinery of government in many ways, once they then open the books like they did, and then somebody says, well, actually, we're going to overhaul the business rate system, and they will tap them on the shoulder and go, well, that's all good and well, but actually this brings in about £30 billion, and actually it's a really, really easy way to collect the money. So unless you're going to come up with something that collects the same amount or more and actually does it in an equally efficient and fair way, then we're not going to touch it. And I think what's effectively happened is, and this is what I'm being told privately, is effectively the civil service have got hold of the politicians and said, yeah, you were talking about doing all these radical things. Well, that ain't a great idea. So actually, let's look at where we are. Let's have things like consultations, or interestingly, yesterday they didn't even call it a consultation; they called it a discussion paper. Let's have a debate. Let's have that discussion about the future of business rates. But actually, guys, we're going to crack on and carry on pretty much as we have been over the last 30 years. And there, I think, lies the problem, is that what you've got now is a scenario where, and I'm struggling, I look at it from a business rates perspective, but I think you have to look at a much wider business perspective as to where business rates fits into the equation. But I could see nothing yesterday I couldn't see anything yesterday where, if I'm a business looking to locate into the UK and open a shop or open a manufacturing facility or open a big office, I couldn't see anything yesterday that was going to encourage me to do that. And there certainly wasn't anything from a business rates perspective that was going to encourage me to do that. In fact, if I looked at the OBR report and I could see that the 30 billion was going to turn into 40 billion within the space of 5 years, that would actually quite concern me. So I think that's the worry. The worry is that, we speak to businesses every day of the week. We have agency colleagues who manage shopping centres, particularly ones in and around London. And that's normally the first port of call of a business that's looking to locate into the UK. And, they will drop in, they'll take a unit in central London. And they'll ask our agency colleagues 3 questions. One is, what's the rent? And the rent might be a turnover, so they can deal with that, because clearly if they're not trading well, they're not paying a big rent, and there's some flexibility from a landlord. They'll ask about the service charge, and they'll talk about, what do they get for that? If it's a shopping centre, they'll get security, they get cleaning, they get lighting, all these other things. And then they'll go, is there anything else? And I go, yeah, you got business rates. And they go, well, what's that? Well, okay, what's that? And I go, well, that's going to be pretty much half. In fact, it's going to be about 55, 56% of the rent you're going to be paying. Well, what do we get for that? And then there's kind of a stunned silence at that point, because you go, well, that's just the UK. That's just what you get for being in the UK. Is that for the bin collections? No, because you're paying for that through your service charge. Is it for the kind of security? Because, yeah, you pay for the police to an extent through it, but actually that's through your service charge as well. So people start then going, well, actually, what am I getting for this? Now, you can have that wider discussion about, the streets are safe, and we pay for being in the UK, and it's a safe haven for investment, and all of those things. But the problem is, if you are a business and you're looking to drop into the UK, and you've got to pay that tax, those business rates, that property tax from day one, before the till has even started ringing, right? You've got, at that point, you go, okay, let me run the numbers again, because I'm not quite sure that's necessarily going to work. That conversation happens every day of the week, every single day of the week. And that is the issue that I don't think the Labour Party, the Labour government have really got to grips with this budget. Now, they might say it's going to get better. This is the worst budget we're ever going to have. We've just laid out the disaster that we've inherited, and things will improve. The problem with that, of course, is that there's nothing in the narrative that came out yesterday that's really saying we've got a roadmap for significant reform. And then you look at the OBR figures, which say actually the total that they're going to take is going to go up by a third in 5 years. So there's nothing there that gives you the confidence that, quite honestly, what we're going to get in the next 5 years is any different to what we've had over the last 30. And that is kind of a little bit disappointing and a little bit depressing in some ways for business, because the opportunity is there. They've got a big majority. They can pretty much do what they want to do. But they've just decided, for whatever reason, to focus on other areas. Now, does that mean we're going to give up the dialogue? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that we're going to continue those discussions? Absolutely. But what we're not going to do is give them an easy ride just because they're new kids on the block. Just because they're saying nice things, if they're doing things which we think are harming the UK PLC and the competitiveness of this country, then we should call them out, and that's what we'll continue to do.
I don't really want to move away from rates, but for a moment, like if you just look at the budget, you said that they're focused on other things, but there wasn't. You wouldn't say that there was any any great reform anywhere else. You wouldn't say that they'd redone something else or, rewritten another thing. It was just everything just seemed tinkering on the edges rather than there was no wholesale reform on anything. You couldn't, like today, and I think that's half the problem, is that the media is now focused on the tax rises rather than something else that could have been positive. But I just felt like they really did sell to us that they were going to come in and do wholesale reform, and that just hasn't happened.
Yeah, and I think this is the issue. I think the kind of, I suppose the narrative had been set with what came out from the Prime Minister a few weeks ago when it was talking about the black hole and all the rest of it. I think at that point the bubble was burst of any optimism that we might have that there were going to be significant changes because of all that narrative that was coming out. I think, again, privately, what I'm being told is that, Rachel Reeves probably walked into number 11 with all great, lots of great hope and lots of ideas. But effectively, the Treasury and the mandarins that sit in and around number 11 have effectively kind of explained to her how things actually do work, and how they work now is how they're going to work over the next 5 years is how they've worked over the last 30. And I think that's the disappointing thing. And as I say, if you could look at the OBR report and say, actually, what they've said is it's only 20 billion they're going to collect in business rates in 5 years' time, you could kind of go, well, yeah, we've got to suck it up now, guys, but don't worry, on the horizon, they are going to challenge the actual quantum of business rates, and they clearly can see that there are opportunities to help business. But there's none of that, and I think that's the worst thing. But you're right, in terms of anything else, I think it was a pretty depressing sort of narrative all round. And what I'm struggling with, particularly from a retail perspective, and the whole of the hospitality and leisure sector, what was interesting yesterday is that businesses, pretty much a lot of SMEs have had this retail, hospitality and leisure relief pretty much for the last 4 or 5 years, pretty much since COVID. So there were reliefs that were given, obviously 100%, then it went down, then it went up again. And then for the last year or so, it's been 75% allowance. So you've effectively got a 75% reduction off your rates bill. Now, the Labour Party and the Labour government would say, well, you can't continue to keep giving people these reliefs because at some point, you've got to wean people off the drug that is the relief that they've been given. But the problem is, if people have had it for 5 years, it's very difficult not to bake that into your business plan and expect that to continue. Now, the issue that what they did yesterday was, they've now given businesses less than 6 months to plan for what effectively is going to be a 140% increase in their business rates bill next April. Now, you might go, well, they should have been saving for it for the last 4 years because they knew that relief was going to be taken away. So what they painted the picture yesterday was that they've reduced, they're continuing to give relief of 40%. But if you reduce the relief from 75, so instead of paying 25% of your bill, you're now paying 60% of your bill because the relief's been reduced to 40. Overnight, from the 1st of April next year, that's a 140% increase. Now, if you said to any business in the country, your electricity bill's going up 140%, or any other major outgoing that you had in your business, of which business rates is one of them, is going up by 140%, there would be a major uproar. But that's effectively what they announced yesterday. Yeah. Now they dressed it up as we're going to give 40% relief, but that's not what it means to a small business.
It's not the reality, is it?
The reality is your bill's just increased by 140%. So now I'm not saying eventually that shouldn't be reduced, but what I am saying is, if your mantra in the run up to the election was the only mention of business rates was in the same sentence as the high street, and we're going to help the high street and we're going to level out the playing field. Well, you've just increased the rates bills of a lot of SMEs who are retailers by 140%. Worse than that, what you've then said is you've got a roadmap now that by 2026 you're going to have lower multipliers for the retail, hospitality, and leisure sector. Now that sounds great, right? That sounds promising. However, what they did say is in order to pay for that, there's going to be an even higher multiplier on all properties, including retail, hospitality, and leisure, with properties over £500,000 rateable value. So what that means is any large shop on a high street is going to be paying significantly more than they are now. So they're paying 55% now. So you can only assume that it's going to be 60% and above, potentially.
Yeah.
So bear in mind that those businesses that have those large properties employ most of the people on the high street. How's that going to encourage people to grow their businesses and open more properties? And I think that, you look at the likes of Frasers and, the M&S's of this world and all of these people. What they heard yesterday, is that going to encourage them to invest more in properties?
No.
I don't think so. Because they're calling out now. They're calling it out now as being too much. Why is what was said yesterday going to help? And the other thing that people forget is that the reason they couldn't announce yesterday what those lower multipliers were is because they need to work out what the 2026 values will be for the 26 rating list that the valuation office are working on at the moment. Well, the 23 list is based on values from April 21, which have effectively COVID allowances built in to those values. Well, thankfully, we're now the other side of COVID. So it would stand to reason then that the values for 26 are going to have that COVID allowance removed. So there's a good chance that most retail properties, I would say the average retail property, will probably go up in value by between 20 and 30%. So even if you reduce the multiplier by 20 or 30%, it's
going to be higher.
You're actually back to where you are, back to where you started.
So I just can't get my head around. It's just there's no logic. Like it's almost like I don't know. They're saying that they're gifting something to somebody, but they're not really. And I think one thing I can't get my head around is that it seems like it's that business rates seem unnecessarily complicated, and maybe it's by design, or maybe they've just got that way. I don't know. And but what I did notice in doing my research, not just for this episode, but over COVID, writing about rates and so on, is that there seems to be a large subset of people or businesses that don't actually pay rates, and whether it's small business or I think Scotland's got like 8 different ones, disability and so on, disability a company or a owner that's disabled and so on, and you think, and they're all well and good, but is the fact that just too many businesses don't pay rates, and charities, of course, they pay I think they get 80% off their rates.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
And charities are businesses to some degree. If they're taking a retail spot in a retail location, they are businesses. They employ people. It's not all volunteers like it used to be. So if you basically rewrote the business tax rate system and just said every business is going to pay it, however, it's going to be tapered, and it's going to be, small business will still get a discount, but you have to pay. Everybody has to pay. Have I got it wrong? Am I missing something?
No, I think you've actually nailed it, to be honest. I think that if you look at the rating list at the moment, there are 2.15 million entries. So there are 2.15 million, let's say, properties. They're called hereditaments, but they're effectively, every shop on the high street is one of those. So effectively, you've got 2.15 million entries in the rating list. Of those, 700,000 don't pay anything. So you've got about a third that don't actually pay anything. And when Barclay did his review in Scotland, he talked about rating deserts, where he would go through whole towns and villages where nobody paid anything. And the reason, and I'm not here to say that people shouldn't get relief, because and a lot of charities, well, most charities do some amazing work. I think the issue that you have is that if you have a scenario where you've got a tax which is just over 55%, it will be from next April, heading towards 60%, then what that means is you've got to give relief to people because a lot of people can't afford that. But the problem is these things don't happen overnight. But if you have a scenario over 30 years, or over now what is 34 years, leading to 35 years, where every government of every persuasion, Labour, Conservative, and I would throw the Lib Dems into this during the coalition, that if because of political expediency they decide to give relief to a certain sector, what that means is they're still going to collect, in today's terms, the £30 billion. So if they give concessions to one particular sector or one particular area, then if they still want to collect the same amount of money, which is why it's called a rate and not a tax, there's a quantum that they need to effectively collect. And if that figure is 30 billion, then all that means is the ones that are paying it are going to pay proportionately more. Now, overnight, nothing dramatic happens. But if year after year after year there are concessions given, then all that means is the headline figure keeps going up. So you get to a situation 34 years later, and we're talking about a tax which is heading towards 60%, and it's heading towards 60% for the ones who do pay, because there's a third now who don't pay anything. And so the reason they have to give more concessions, it's a vicious circle, is because the headline rate keeps going up. So the higher it gets, the more relief they've got to give. So the ones that do get captured by it pay more and more. Now, what we've said is, well, actually, and I've said this before, and I may have said it to you before when we spoke. I've never met a small business. I've never met any business that said to me, we shouldn't pay anything. We shouldn't pay a penny in business rates because we don't want to help the community. We don't want to pay for services. We don't want to pay for people keeping the streets clean. We don't want to pay for social care. I've never met a business who's ever said that. But I haven't met many businesses equally have said, I tell you what, 55% is the right tax. So the point we're making is, which is the point you've made, is if everybody contributed something, even if you started off at, let's say, a 10% tax on your rates bill, right, for the smallest properties, and then you built it up, so you got to no more than, let's say, 30, 35p, which is where it should be, then I can tell you now, we wouldn't be talking about business rates. People would pay it, they'd take it on the chin, and they'd move on. It wouldn't be a headline. It wouldn't take up any space anywhere. And what you wouldn't have then is the need for all the reliefs, of which there are about 14 in existence at the moment. You've got transitional relief, you've got rural relief, you've got the green relief, you've got obviously retail, hospitality and leisure relief. They just grow and grow and grow. But the reason you have those reliefs is because fundamentally the quantum that you're taking off people who do pay is too high. Once you get back to that system where you've got 10, 15, 20%, no more than 35%, what you have then is you could wipe away pretty much all of those reliefs. Most of them could disappear because people are paying, they're paying a figure which they can manage, which they can deal with. And if they want to stay a small business and they want to pay a relatively small amount, be it 10p in the pound or 10%, then fine. But if they want to grow, then fine, they can grow because they know they can grow and they're not going to fall off a cliff edge, lose a relief and pay double what they're paying or 3 times what they're paying now, or even 140%, which is about to happen. So you have a situation where over 30 years, because of those decisions, you've got to where you are now. If you'd have started off in the early days, you wouldn't have seen that. But if you've got a tax base which a third don't pay, then it just stands to reason that the ones that do pay are going to pay proportionately more. And then you've got laid over that the issue about, the online giants and all of those things, which in many ways is a little bit of a red herring. The business rate system, if you look at the fact that you have a revaluation in property and you look at the inflation in the rateable value, it's the inflation in the rateable value that means that the actual multiplier shouldn't need to change, because the inflation is built in every reval. So the property that you're in, your warehouse, your office, the value from 1990 to where we are now would have gone up probably by 2, 3, or 4 times. That's the inflation. But what's happened is the rateable value's gone up 2, 3, 4 times, but the multiplier's gone from 34p and it's now heading for 60p. So not only has your rateable value been inflated, but the multiplier has been inflated as well.
Wow.
And that's been inflated because less and less people are paying the actual full amount that they should be paying, because of these decisions that are being made by all politicians.
And in my basic understanding of rates, I see. So if we look at the high street, you see the much disliked sports shops, and you see something like Sports Direct, JD Sports, very big buildings. So they'd be paying rates. Then you've got, in hospitality, at least, many look down on Weatherspoons, but they would pay rates. The local independent small business won't be, but everyone else will be. And then you've got the likes of Amazon and so on, who also pay rates, but I guess in proportion to their wealth or their income, they pay a lower amount per turnover. Now, people talk about it like that, although that's not how business rates should be calculated. So what's your thoughts on, you mentioned that it's a red herring. Could you elaborate a little bit on do you think if it's fair to tax them more?
But and this was the narrative that was actually mentioned in the papers that were released yesterday around this multiplier for everything over 500,000, and they actually specifically said, and this will hit some of the online giants who occupy large properties. So it's clear that the aim of this higher multiplier for large properties is because they want to capture, some of the sheds and the big logistics facilities that are occupied by these businesses. But the problem is what you're trying to do, and this is where I think it's either lazy politics or lazy policy, is what you're trying to do is you're trying to use a business rate system to actually capture more tax from a worldwide conglomerate who, quite honestly, they think doesn't pay sufficient tax in this country. Well, if you're trying to use a business rates tax system to do that, then all you're going to end up doing is clobbering everybody, because if you think Google and Amazon and all these big companies don't pay enough tax, then deal with it through a digital tax or through a worldwide agreement that you're going to have to actually capture more tax from these people. I'm not saying whether they're paying the right amount of tax or not. What I am saying is that the business rate, to use the business rate system in order to grab more tax from them, is too blunt an instrument, because all you're going to do, every high street retailer in this country, and you've mentioned Sports Direct and people like that and JD Sports, they all have massive warehouses as well. So they're going to get clobbered.
They get it twice.
In fact, every manufacturing facility is going to get clobbered. Every car plant in the country is going to get clobbered, right? Every steel facility is going to get clobbered. So if all you're trying to do is grab one particular area of an online giant because they don't think they pay enough tax, then unfortunately the collateral damage there is everyone who occupies a large building in this, or a large valuable building, and it could even be a large office in central London. So I think what you're trying to do is use a really blunt instrument to actually do something that you're not happy about.
It's the wrong tool for the job, isn't it? I like to think of these taxes as tools, and VAT has a certain aspect of what it's meant, why it generates a certain amount of income, and business rates too. But if you're using business rates to penalise businesses as a quick windfall tax that you can get through quickly, and then make it sound like we're penalising the wealthy internationalists, I feel like it's a bit disingenuous, really.
It absolutely is, because if you look at the rating list, there's going to be, it's going to capture everybody, because all they're talking about is anything over £500,000 rateable value. And again, I think you look at Amazon, in terms of business rates, they will have a massive bill, and equally, and this is where the inflation comes into it. If you look at the growth in the value of logistics facilities, because clearly there's been a lot of demand for these facilities from all retailers with bricks and mortar portfolios, as well as just pure online giants. there's been a massive growth in the rental value of these logistics facilities over recent years, and that's been captured in the new rating list as well, and will be captured in the next one. So these people are paying proportionately more than they did 10, 15 years ago, because the values of these properties has grown over that period. So the rating system is doing what it's doing, which is capturing the value. So these people are paying more in any case. And as I say, if you're using a really, really blunt instrument to do a job and play to a certain audience, which is why it was pretty disingenuous them talking about capturing online giants yesterday in this 500,000 threshold. Well, quite honestly, there's pretty much every Asda, every Tesco's, every Sainsbury's in the country is going to be over 500,000. So they're paying as well.
Is there any way for, like, when you talk about like wealth taxes and so on, and I know we're not here, but when we do, the rich, the very wealthy, usually are already well ahead of that. Their money's protected. They're they're multinational. They've got good lawyers, good accountants. It's very quick for them to move things around. Can that be true with business rates? Or once it's once someone sets a rule, is there any way to wiggle out of it?
It's very difficult, which is why it's such an attractive tax, because you can't. I mean, I say this, if you look at Philip Green, I mean, I never worked for Philip Green, but I know people who did, and I'd seen a lot of things that he'd said about business rates, and it was the one tax he hated more than any other one, and it's pretty obvious why. Because it's the one thing that you can't pick up a high street property and move it to Monaco and pretend you ain't going to pay anything. So, not that I'm suggesting he was going to do that, but no. You know what I'm saying is that you can't. There is no way of wriggling out of it. But in a way that's kind of it's a great thing from a Treasury official to say why it's so attractive. But that's not a good reason to continue with it at the level of quantum, because all it's going to do is frustrate new investors into the UK to actually grow and develop more properties. I think that as I say, I think that that the values that are inherent in these properties are reflective of what people are paying, and I think that you're barking up the wrong tree if you think that the business rate system should deal with those undoubtedly difficult questions of raising more tax. The one thing that I'm afraid that I kind of half expected something might be said on it, and you've mentioned wealth tax, is the council tax arena. And I've always said that the council tax, if you look on any local authority's accounts, business rates and council tax income is on the same line. And it's pretty much, they bring in the same amount of money nationally. But there's a massive difference and disparity around the country between what's collected in council tax and where it's collected. So, we did a study recently, the average council tax bill in Westminster was around about £900. The average property value, 2.3 million. Stockton-on-Tees, average council tax bill, £1,500. Average property value, 155 grand. There's a massive. That makes sense, does it? There's a massive. I mean, seriously, people were rioting in the streets because of the poll tax. If people actually understood what was going on now, they'd probably be doing the same. Because why would a nurse in Stockton-on-Tees pay a property tax which on those numbers I've just given you works out at something like 13 times more than a billionaire who's got a property in Regent's Park? Doesn't make any sense.
It makes me. I'm smiling, not because I'm happy about it, but me and a friend were talking about this morning. He mentioned Westminster, and we compared it to Blackpool, and he said exactly the same thing as you. That it just doesn't make sense that this exists. One of the upsides, I guess, Westminster's got is that there's a lot of houses in a small area. They can easily collect bins, and so on. They probably don't have a lot of expenses when it comes to social and like mental health and costs and all of this. But the point still stands, though, that that doesn't make sense. The logic doesn't make sense that someone in Blackpool, Stockton-on-Tees, is paying more than someone in Westminster. It just doesn't make
Well,
sense.
if you look at, but this is where if you look at the business rate side of it, Westminster collects, I got the figures in front of me now, but they collect something like, I don't know, something like £2.5–3 billion in business rates. But most of it gets shoveled into a pot, which is distributed around the country. Now, you might go, well, that's because there's so much, in Westminster, there's so much central government funding that goes into making Westminster such an amazing place. And it is an amazing place. And obviously it's the capital and all the rest of it. But there's an acceptance that Westminster collect all that money, but a lot of that money is used to subsidise other parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can understand that happens on business rates, why don't you understand that it shouldn't happen on residential as well, on domestic properties? Because the principle's already established. So why don't you have the same council tax band and the same council tax quantum throughout the whole country? Put it all together and then collect it. And that, I'm afraid, is one way of filling the gap. The problem you've got there is that in Westminster, they call council tax, they call it the live rail. Don't touch it. That's what they refer to. They literally, because of they're still scarred by what happened to Margaret Thatcher.
But do you not think that to some degree that, like, if government or politicians or civil servants, if they treated the population like decent people that can understand things that are difficult, so you start having a discussion and saying, look, here's a problem. It may not affect you, but it affects X amount of other people. It's something we're going to have to work on in this term. We're going to have discussions about it. Maybe not so much a referendum, but discussions, so we can understand how we're going to move forward. We don't really want to talk about it because it's a scar from the 80s, but we need to deal with it.
Yeah.
Why should anything be untouchable? I just find that incredibly odd. And naive.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm naive.
I agree with you. But I can tell you now, I've literally spoken to politicians in the last week about this, and they roll their eyes when I mention about council tax, because I think everyone's worried that there's going to be something in the Daily Mail that's going to go, valuation office going to value you for having a big garden or a nice view, or they're going to tax you for looking out at sea or whatever it might be, and everyone panics thinking their bill's going to go up. Whereas the reality is, if they knew how unfair it was at the moment, they would accept it. But and I think you're right, I think there is a grown-up conversation to have. But I can tell you now, every politician I speak to, every civil servant I speak to, senior Treasury officials at the same time, you mention council tax, you mention about maybe reorganising the way it's funded, the way it's collected and the way it's valued, and they do not want to know. They do not want to know.
I'd imagine that the thing with business rates, I can't remember who I was talking to about it. It was a while ago. And they said it's probably never really been dealt with because there's not many winners and it probably creates more losers. So why would any government want to really do it? And
yeah, I think I'm going to get that, but that's because we all think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, what you would say is, the answer is right. The answer is okay. Let's look at two things, right? I'll give you two examples, and I know that the European tax landscape is slightly different to the UK's, but if you go to other countries, and I've spoken to some large retailers, and I won't say who in the last couple of weeks, and they invest in continental Europe as well as the UK. They have a big retail footprint all over, and the issue about investing in other countries across Europe, the property tax doesn't even form part of the equation, right? That doesn't form part of the equation. Now, I'm not saying that in some cases there might not be local taxes that don't exist in this country, and I'm not saying that there might be, the actual cost of operating in these countries might be quite high. But what I am saying is the business rates and the property tax issue does not become part of the reason why people say no. And in this country, it does. So why? And then I come back to the other point I was going to make is if people go, well, I don't want to do this because I'm going to be worse off, and this is going to happen, I'm going to be worse off. You go, well, actually, let's look at the growth in the economy for the last 14 years. In fact, for the last 16 years, it's been shocking, right? As a UK PLC, the performance of the economy over the last 14, 16 years has been shocking. The average guy in the street is actually earning less money in real terms now than he did 16 years ago, right? Something is not right, right? So why don't we try and do something different that might actually change that landscape? Rather than saying, oh, well, it's bad and it could get worse if we do this, or let's talk about, having a different tax landscape that might encourage investment. Why don't we try that for a change rather than doing the same that we've done for pretty much the last 14, 16 years?
In your mind, if someone said to you, John, you're in charge, mate, you could do whatever you need to do, but we can't lose money, but how would you completely reform the business rate landscape? And whilst you're there, if you want to throw in the council tax, but if you need to, that is. But yeah, well, how would you do it? You've been in the business long enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy for me to say because I don't need to be elected. Yeah. I mean, I suppose I need to be elected by clients, so I have to be mindful of that as well. But it comes back to what I said before. I've never met any business that doesn't understand that they need to pay and contribute to the public purse. But what I would say is everybody should pay something, all right? Everybody should pay something because everybody benefits from the services that those taxes pay for. So everybody should pay something. Should it be anywhere near 55p in the pound? Absolutely not. It shouldn't be any more than 30, 35p. Let's say 35p. So you start from 35p, then you work down, right? Everybody pays something. You can fill the gap. What you're doing is you're actually encouraging people to open more properties, to open more offices, to open more branches, to open more manufacturing facilities because people are investing. The UK is open for inward investment. Potentially then what you could also do, you could hand in hand have a council tax reval. I think that could also raise some extra money as well because I think if I'm a billionaire and I'm owning a property worth £100 million in central London and I'm paying probably around the maximum I'm probably paying is probably about 1,500 quid a year. I think I'm getting away with murder, quite honestly, right?
Yeah.
So I'm looking at that system thinking that there's a big gap that could be filled there. And then I think perhaps slightly more controversially, and I think that it's interesting when you look at the BIDs, the business improvement districts, a lot of landlords contribute to those. But for most landlords who have a high occupancy, they might have, let's say, 95, 98% occupancy, which is great. They would pay hardly any business rates, yet they benefit from the services and from the infrastructure and from all of those things that the business rate system pays for. So you might even say that landlords pay for something. And again, if you look across the water to the continent, most property taxes, the landlords and the tenants pay something together.
Okay.
It isn't just, whereas in this country, obviously landlords pay if the property's empty, and that's kind of madness as well.
Yeah.
So at the point where they can afford it less, because they're not even getting any rent, they're being hammered with a big rates bill.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, what if everybody, if the actual quantum is no more than about 35p, then the chances are most landlords will have a much greater occupancy level. The business rates when they're empty, I think that quite honestly, is ridiculous where it is at the moment. But I think that what you should potentially look at is, again, all landlords paying something. I'm not talking about 35p. I'm not talking about anywhere near that. But let's say come back to the 10p for small businesses. Let's say every landlord paid that. Now, the argument that people say is, well, all the landlords will do is pass it on to the tenants. Well, they could do. But what I think we've seen over recent years is the average length lease has plummeted. And actually during COVID, what you saw was the ability for landlords to negotiate, good landlords, I would describe them, to have that relationship with their tenants to say, look, we can see that you're struggling, we're going to help you. So if you've got an open and honest relationship with your tenants, and that relationship that I think in many cases is a great example of how it should work, then if a landlord says, well, actually, guys, I've just been hammered with a 10p tax on the business rates here, I don't like this, I'm putting your rent up. You go, well, I tell you what, best thing I can do is when my lease is up in about 18 months, right, you better find another tenant because I'm going somewhere else now, right? Because I ain't going to suck that 10p up that you've got to pay because I'm paying 35p, right? We all want what that system pays for. You benefit from it as much as I do because of the whole public realm of what's invested and everything in society. So actually, why don't you just suck it up, right? And if you don't want to suck it up, then you might be a landlord who has a greater void level. So what I'm saying is it's not about hammering landlords, but what I'm saying is you spread it out, right? Load. You spread the love, you spread the load, and then there isn't this. We're heading for 60p tax, which is where we are going at the moment.
It doesn't look like it's great news, does it? Like it does. It looks like, the multiplier that's in flux, and then obviously the rateable value will probably be rated as higher than before because why wouldn't it? So it almost looks like a double increase is on the horizon, and more people will probably get relief, and then a higher proportion of larger properties will again carry the burden. And it sort of feels like there is sometimes an argument within business that says, oh, small business always gets the headache or the pressures, where actually they do get the pressures, but you can see how large a business like your Tesco's, like your JD Sports, like your Amazons, they're probably going to say, well, actually, we're actually holding all of this. We're the ones that have got the broader shoulders.
Yeah, I mean, I think, clearly, I think from yesterday's budget, it was very much big businesses have got to suck it up, and clearly that, and the business rates in some ways is like that. But I think it's worse than that though, because if you look at the, small business relief, the SBRR, if you've got a small property which is under 12,000 rateable value, you don't pay a penny. Between 12 and 15, you'll pay gradually more. By the time you get to 15, you're paying the full amount.
Yeah.
So there's a proper cliff edge. So you're going from effectively nothing to 55p, or well, it's actually slightly less than that, but it's about 50p, right? It's just around 50p, 49.9. But you're paying no tax to a 50% tax by putting on a small extension to your property. Right? How can that be right? There's no incentive there, is there?
Yeah.
There's no incentive. So you've got that cliff edge. So I think that it's worse than just the big businesses paying the full amount. If you're a small business and you're not paying any business rates at the moment because you've got a relatively small property, where's the incentive for you to open another branch,
no, exactly.
another office, or extend it? There's no incentive, and that's where it's wrong. But I think in some ways it'll probably get worse before it gets better. But I think what will happen is people will eventually, I think, wake up to the tax burden that's been layered over British business from yesterday's budget and what's coming, and they'll look back in a year or two, and might be even longer than that, and go, actually, has the economy grown? And I have my serious doubts as to whether it will grow.
So in some ways, this could be a gift. The fact that we're all going to go through a few years of pain, we're all going to look at it and say, well, actually, are we any better off? And if we're not, then we know that wasn't the answer. Taxing us more and throwing money at things wasn't the answer. Well, we don't know that yet. But.
Well, I mean, but it kind of history tells us that.
Yeah,
I mean, when the Labour government introduced that 50% income tax, they actually collected less than when I think it was 40%.
Oh, really? Okay.
So it was like it's obvious because people are going to go, why am I going to work harder to pay you even more? It's not going to happen. So you end up collecting less. And I think you look at the business rate system, I think what you'll see is, which is what's happened. Everyone's, coming back to the politics of the narrative before the election, it was all about growth. I didn't see anything. I don't think growth was mentioned much yesterday. I didn't see anything that was going to encourage growth. No. So I think if you are committed to growing the economy, then you've got to change where we're going. And you can't layer on that tax burden both in other taxes but as well as business rates to the level that you're suggesting in the OBR report and think people are going to continue to grow their business. Yeah. It's not going to happen.
What's your thoughts on the devolved nations, like not as in what do we think on a wide level, but just on rates alone, like because every sort of devolved nation has its own let's say quirks. But when I was reading up on Scotland, they had like 8 or 9 different ways to not pay rates, and a friend of mine who wanted to open just a little coffee shop, just a tiny little coffee shop, had to pay rates from day one because there wasn't any relief for a small coffee shop owner, and you think, well, and England's got what, 5 or 6 give or take. Scotland has Northern Ireland, sorry, they've got different ones as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like, do you sort of think, who's got it right out, or the least worst out of all the devolved nations? And do you think we should just say, no, there's one and that's it?
I think that if you go again, you go back to history, I suppose, in some ways. If you go look at the pre-1990 level, I'll come on to reliefs and how those devolved governments manage business rates. But if you go back to pre-1990, you had effectively a different multiplier in every billing authority, in every local authority. So Westminster notoriously had a low one. Then you go to a place like Sheffield or Sandwell in the West Midlands, where the actual rate in the pound might even be double what it was in Westminster. Yeah. Because they could set their own rate. In fact, it was collected, it was spent locally. They had to have high rates in the pound because they needed the money. And then in 1990, you had for the first time you had this uniform business rate, and it was almost you look back now and you think it must have been horrendous before. And I actually worked pre-1990 in the industry, and so you literally had a book every year. You literally had a handbook every year of the rate in the pound for every local authority. So if you're investing somewhere in the UK, it's bad enough that the multiplier is 55p now, but actually if you're investing in Stockton or Durham or London, it's going to be 55p. You know what it is, right? You know what. Whereas before then, you could have gone, oh, I've opened a shop in London and I'm only paying, whatever rate in the pound it is. It's actually really good. And then you go, right, so should we open a few more properties around the country? And you go, oh my God, I've just had the rates bill from Sheffield and it's 3 times London. So how could that be a good thing? So the move to a multiplier which is uniform, the uniform business rate in 1990, was actually a really good thing, particularly for businesses who had multiple properties around the country, because they could budget, they could manage, they knew whatever it was, they knew if they were going to agree a rent of 50 grand, they're going to be paying 35p of that figure, wherever it was in the country. So it was a more valuable area. They're going to pay a quantum which is greater, but it's still going to be the same multiplier. The problem with the devolved governments is, and this has only really happened over the last, I suppose, 10, 15 years or so, probably longer than that, but is the fact that now you're almost going backwards to where you were. So when big businesses ask us for budgets, we go, right, we need one for Wales, but actually, and then we need one for Scotland, but there's different multipliers for different properties, how big they are. Then we've got Northern Ireland, and Christ, that's difficult because every local authority over there sets a different one, and they're all over the place. So it kind of feels like it's a massive backward step. Then you get everybody locally, like Scottish government or Welsh government, and they start to do these things. Now the reality is, they end up with the same answer, but they just call it something else. So they'll have different reliefs. So we're going to decide to do this, or we're going to clobber empty rates a little bit more because we really hate landlords. Or it's almost a race to the bottom as to who can be more anti-business. That's what it looks like. So I don't think there's any, from a business perspective, if you're looking into the UK and you're looking at the UK to invest, you're going to go, right, that's what I'm going to pay. You're not going to go, right, what do I pay in Wales? Oh Christ, is it that much there? Scotland, really? I've got to pay that? And then, no, I forget Northern Ireland. Right, you've got to be joking. So it cannot make the UK any more competitive or any easier to do business if we keep layering over these different changes. It plays into a narrative of giving people this local autonomy and this local control. But the reality is, if you're a business, All you're looking to do is open businesses, create jobs, and make it as seamless as possible. None of this local multipliers in different jurisdictions around the UK is actually going to add to that. It's only going to detract.
Yeah. It's mind-boggling. I just don't get my head around it. And I'm just looking at some of the notes, and I think one of the good things that I can see with Northern Ireland is they've got a 70% reduction for industrial, and I imagine that's anybody that's manufacturing. And I could see how that could boost the economy, actually, like if you're manufacturing something. And I guess most...
Yeah, I mean, but again, it's like all of these reliefs, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like we talked about. It's great. You're invested in there. And it's like, oh, we're only paying 30%. That's amazing. Until they actually move the goalposts, and now you're paying 70% instead of 30%. The whole point of these things is that if you have a modest, sensible tax to begin with, and you're consistent, and this is the biggest thing that businesses want, right? They want consistency, they want certainty. And if they know that they're paying 30, 35p in business rates, that's your multiplier, then they can carry on. They haven't got to go, oh, God, what's she going to say? What's the Chancellor going to say? Oh, is it going up? Oh, God, how much is it going up by? Let's just plan, right? Let's just actually look at investing in the UK 5-10 years and going, right, we know whatever happens, we're going to be paying around 35p, about a third of the rental value of the property. That's what we're going to be paying. Let's not get dramatic about it. That's what we're paying. Let's build it into our business plan, and if we can afford to pay that, we'll open more properties and we'll invest and we'll create more jobs. Not, okay, let's give people a 2-year holiday, or, okay, well, we might increase it. It might be 75%, but now it's 40%, but we're not quite sure it's going to be in 2 years' time. How's that going to encourage people to plan and invest? It isn't. It isn't. And that's the problem. That you go, the reason they're having to give 70% reduction in Northern Ireland, because some of those multipliers you're looking at are well above 60%. That's why they have to give the relief, because quite honestly, those multipliers are ridiculous. I'm not being funny. Is the Northern Ireland economy smashing it at the minute? I don't see that. I don't see the rest of the UK smashing it either. But
yeah, no, I agree completely. None of them are cruising forwards. They all just seem to be teetering along, and one little issue after the other.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why you've got to say. I mean, look, there will be times when businesses and maybe sectors need some help, and there are, but even things like the improvement relief and things to help encourage people to do it. The reason they're having to give these reliefs is because the quantum is so high to begin with. You actually lower it to 35p. You don't need to layer over these. You don't need to persuade people to have a temporary lower rates bill to invest. You just have a lower rates bill for everyone all the time.
And if you look at town centres, which for the most part, they're decimated, in a lot of, and again, I don't think it's because of rates on their own. I think times have changed. Everything's moved away from town centres. You're opening. I think one of the things that everyone avoids talking about is the fact that we've got all these outside of town shopping centres now. We've got all these cinema parks. Everything's outside. Even in my hometown, which is Nuneaton, where I was brought up, the town centre, they opened, what is it called? Bermuda Industrial Estate, Bermuda, I don't know what you'd call a cinema park or whatever, but there's things there. So why would people go to the town centre where you have to pay for parking and so on? It adds all up. There was never enough parking spaces, whereas there's lots of free parking spaces. So I just think that no one's really talking about how society has changed as well in this, but I could see how having a better rate or a better system of rates would also help town centres and start bringing them back up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, this is you can't. I suppose you can't book the market if the market is moving to a scenario where people prefer to go out of town because of the way they are, and there's too much retail in a town centre, and some of that needs to be remodeled for residential, then so be it. But the problem you have is that and I've been to town centres all over the country, and some of them are pretty sorry places to visit. But you look at when you speak to the agents who are managing the shopping centres with large voids, one of the biggest issues people have is business rates, and the fact that they've got to pay them from day one. And if you look back over the last 14 years, you effectively had a reval, a 7-year gap, then you had a 6-year gap, and the rateable values did not marry anywhere near what the level of value was. So there was such a massive distortion between the actual true rateable value and what the rental value was. Now, a rateable value should just mirror the rental value, but if you have a 7-year gap and a 6-year gap, then there's going to be a massive difference. So you had a situation where people will go into a shopping centre, and Nuneaton might be a good example, where you go, well, the landlord is quite happy to do a deal with me, and I'm going to pay 50 grand rent, and he's going to give me 6 months rent free, and it's a 3-year lease, so that equivalent figure is perhaps nearer to 40 grand. Then you look at the rateable value, and the rateable value is like 100 grand because it was valued in another time in another era, and it didn't actually match the situation that's on the ground now. So you actually end up paying more in business rates than you do in rent. So if you have a much narrower gap, when now thankfully we're going to a 3-year reval, but if you get to an annual reval, then there's a greater comparison between the rent. So if you go to Nuneaton and somebody says, actually, that unit now is only worth 20 grand as a rent, and I can afford to pay 20 grand, then what you should know, because you've got confidence in the business rate system, is that pretty shortly thereafter, the rateable value should be 20 grand. And now you're paying, let's say, where you should be, a third of that. So you understand that. But the problem is there have been so many scenarios around the country where people have gone to shopping centres and gone, right, I've agreed a rent with the landlord and I'm paying 20 grand, but the rateable value is actually 50 because it's stuck either in, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years before as a valuation date, in an era where it doesn't resemble where we are today. So you need a much smaller gap so the system then can react to the changes, which will encourage more people again to look at the numbers and go, right, if I'm going to agree a 30, 20 grand rent, I know actually shortly thereafter I should be paying about a third in business rates. And so people can understand that. And then people can look forward and plan, not think, Christ, this is a lottery, or look at the rating list, or there are professional advisors look and they go, that 20 grand rent you're paying, I know you've agreed that today, but I've just looked at the rateable value and it's actually about 50 grand. At that point, people just walk away. Yeah. They walk away.
Yeah, no, definitely. So to end this, do we see the current government and the shadow government, do you see them understanding these problems? Do you see them absorbing them and trying to actually fix them, or are we in for the long run?
I think I'd like to think. I think that the optimist in me hopes that the penny will drop. I think the penny will start to drop in the next year or two when there's little investment going on in our high streets because of what's been announced. And I think we can only continue to have that dialogue. I think that clearly there is a big fiscal issue across the whole country in the economy, which I think business rates is probably going to be a victim of maybe in the short term. But I think we've got to continue to do this. And one of the things that was mentioned yesterday is the business rate system has been around since 1601, and people say that that's a bad thing. But income tax has probably been around since Roman times and before. So we're not going to abolish income tax just because it's been around for 2,000 years. So why would you get rid of a system which has been around for 400 years just because it's 400 years old? The opposite, in my view, is the case, is that every developed country in the world has a property tax system. And any country that hasn't got a property tax system is getting a property tax system. So when you look at the financial crisis in Greece in the early 2010s, when the IMF and the World Bank went there, the first thing they said to them, have you got a property tax system? And they said, well, yeah, but it isn't very good. And they said, well, you better get one a bit sharpish then, because everybody has one. So to think you can get away with a property tax system is naive, because when they're administered and run properly, they work very well to pay for local services. So I'm hopeful that the penny will start to drop, but I think it's incumbent on leaders of the industry like myself and many others from large organisations, that we continue to talk about the need for reform. And equally, I think that the work, I'm a member of the International Property Tax Institute, IPTI. It's really helpful when you plug into what's going on around the world, that you see that there are very similar issues around the world, but the biggest issue that the UK has got is the quantum that they're leveling on people.
If it's such an efficient tax to regulate and to administer, I just don't understand how we've got into this mess. Because if you'd stuck to what you were saying, which is, let's say small business X percent, 10%, let's say landlords, let's say 10%, and let's everyone else 30%, roughly, just a third. How in your mind, in all the years that you've been in this business, how did we get to all of this then?
Because I'm going to be blunt. Well, I won't be as blunt as perhaps I should be, but let me try and put it. I think, I'm afraid, politicians that I've met over the years, they don't look any further than their next election.
Okay.
And if they're going to say something unpopular, that will bring into question whether they're going to get elected. And what it needs is, it not only needs politicians who are, dare I say, brave. It also needs civil servants who understand a little bit more how the world works from a business perspective and an investment perspective. And I think that we just need to continue to highlight those issues to people. And as I say, it might get worse before it gets better, but I'm still confident that we can turn things around.
No, definitely. And well, John, thanks for your time today. It's been awesome. I've learned a lot. I'm still baffled, but I've learned a lot, to be fair.
Well, I'm sorry for baffling you, but no, listen, it's been great talking to you.
Yeah, it's been great, mate. And, keep doing what you do. Keep, all of the people you work with, keep telling the government. And like you say, hold them to account. And that's not to be negative. That's just, keep pressing them. And hopefully year 2, year 3, they start to realise and we get what we want. But I don't hold out much confidence either. So,
we'll continue to do it anyway.
Exactly.
I think we've got a duty to do it.
All right, man. Have a great day.
Yeah, and you. Thank you.